ones. Yeah, it's a little tight, especially. Yeah,
Yeah.
All right, I'll go ahead and start. So I'm Mike McKenna, and I'm supposedly the chair of the Person Name Subcommittee for CLDR. It's more of a shared chairship between a number of people on the committee, and it's been a long effort to get person names defined in CLDR. So just to kind of start us off, so how many of you have a name that is sometimes difficult for others on your teams to pronounce? Anyone? Okay, look around. Keep your hands up. Okay, this is one reason why we're doing person names. Not to help you pronounce them, but to at least help others be able to format and present your name in a way that you want to be respected, or the way you want to have it shared with others or in your culture. But it also helps you to do the same for names from other people. And how many people get just a little bit frustrated or agitated when people keep mispronouncing your name or presenting it wrong? Or just a few of you? And I bet there's a few of you that, and we're not going to solve this problem here with Unicode, but how many really get annoyed when autocorrect puts the wrong name down? So just a few, okay. So go ahead and start here. So person names is a set of guidelines for how to represent your data to then send it to formatting engines. And so then beyond that, then is a set of patterns for how those names should be formatted based on a number of contexts. It's the latest part added on to LDML, which defines the rest of CLDR, allows for formatting, for instance, for John Smith. And I think this is Li Jiaoyan or something. And defines the formats. Let's say you have data that comes from a database, how that data would then be represented depending on the attributes that you give to the formatting operation. And also defines a set of recommended name fields to use, for instance, a given name, Maria, or a surname, Schmidt, for instance. And we use terms that, based on our reviewers, should be generic across languages and cultures. We don't use first name, last name, because there's several of you here where your first name is your surname and your last name is your given name. So, and you'll see as we go through the presentation that that varies a bit. So what I'm going to do first is just go through some of the basics to give you an idea of what can be done with the standard. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on how the standard is defined, other than to show you how to dive into the survey tool to see what the basic expected results will be. But I'll be showing you kind of how to use it in the more basic formats and go into some special cases. And I'll be emphasizing more of the special cases. We've had a lot of questions come in as tickets on, well, how do I do this? And how do I do that? And my name comes out this way, but I have it that way. So that's how we'll take a look at it. Let me just go back here. So different fields that are in the basic part of the standards: title, given name, given informal. So for instance, Mo instead of Mohan, John instead of Jonathan, and so on. That's something that is entered in the data that comes, like you have your own database. Given to, so we don't use first name, middle name, but for a second or additional following names. Then surname and surname to, and we have two surnames because in a lot of Hispanic cultures, you have two different surnames. It's usually in primo apellido and segundo apellido, or you might see it as paternal surname and maternal surname, but it's usually first and second surname. And then there are a lot of standards. There's a few standards that specify differences in a suffix after the name, differences between a generation and credentials. So generation like junior, senior, the third, which is a separate entity from credentials like an MPA, an RN, a PhD, so on. So these are the fields that we've resolved down to at this point, and I'll show you there's some different modifiers that can be added onto these that extends it a little bit, but we've tried to keep it as close as possible to be able to map back to like HTML autocomplete fields, which is a limited set fields, or HCARD or LDAP, the databases that already exist, but taking into consideration some of the larger standards that have much more information that we didn't want to duplicate completely, because then it starts getting super complex in having a field that can have from 1 to infinity entries, which we wanted to make it so it could still be usable for internet exchange of data and still make it so it formats for the modern format situations that we have in mind. We have not tested it with Egyptian hieroglyphics, and that's not in yet. So when that gets added, I will be excited to demonstrate it, or if it gets added. So basic format attributes that you have. One format attribute is length. A name we have long, medium, and short. So pretty straightforward. And those are different scenarios that you might have for long. For instance, somebody might know some of these names: Mr. Charles Babbage, Mrs. Augusta Ada Byron King, Countess of Lovelace, and Ada Lovelace, who's known as the first programmer. And then the one below, I have to look at my notes here, Li Jun Fan. And I don't know if any of you know who that is, but you'll see later. Yes, you'll see his name represented in different modes later on. And the one below is, I have to read this. The full name is in Arabic, Abu Awafa al-Buzjani, Abu Awafa Muhammad bin Yahya bin Ismail bin Abbas al-Buzjani. And he is a ancient astronomer from the Middle East. And so I have his full long name, and then how it might be represented as medium size, and then it just short may just be Abu Awafa. Another basic format attribute is usage. So we have three that we've defined so far: referring, addressing, and monogram. So referring is when you're talking about a person. So for those who are into grammatical terms, that's the nominative case. Then there's addressing when you're talking to a person. That's the vocative case. And then we're trying to figure out where we would put it. We stuck it in under usages, monogram. So when you're in a chat session and then there's a little circle on the top with some abbreviation of a name or something, this is just a mechanism to do a format for commonly used methods. And that was put in specifically because when going outside of alphabetic scripts, things just get destroyed when they take the first character of the one name and the first character of a second name, for instance, in Chinese names, and put them together. Now it's a completely different name, which isn't at all who the person is. So having rules that are in place. And you'll see the very last one is the Abu Awafa. His monogram And then there's special formats, for instance, to be able to indicate the standalone Arabic characters by putting a little separator in between each one so that it doesn't blend in and start writing it into initial, medial, and ending cases of the Arabic. So that's all in the formatting standard for person name. But then, so using a different usage based on the scenario that you have. And then there's formality, so formal and informal. So formal, like what you would see on a graduation certificate or an award, or when you're introducing someone in a much more formal case. And then informal, just as it is, informal. So examples like Mr. Charles Babbage, Esquire, FRS, informal, depending on the case. The short case would just be Charles. And so I'm not showing the full permutations here, which I'll spell out, and we'll just do a little deep dive into the survey tool to kind of get an idea of how it expands out. So the last one is order, and that's if you want to choose given name first or surname first. And then we have sorting, like how should the names be formatted if they were going to be sorted in a list, or they're going to be sorted, let's say, in an index, or and if you wanted to have them in a particular order. So for instance, if we're using the more informal case, Ada Lovelace would be Lovelace, comma, Ada. And then you'll notice that for Li Junfan, he still has Li as the first name in the sorting. It's Li is the Chinese character at the beginning, and then the given first has Junfan Li. The order has been swapped in that regard, so you can specifically override that. And you notice it says there's a default from the locales, but then for each locale, the patterns have a set of defaults already in place. So if you don't choose that specific parameter, then the default for that locale will be used first. And the defaults can specify the length, the formality, the order of the names, what separators are used between the names. In Western languages, we use spaces. In most Asian languages, there's no space. But if you have Western characters in an Asian context, the standard, the guidelines know to be able to use, oh, I have Western characters, so I'm going to go towards the best fit locale, and that uses spaces, and then the spaces will get inserted. So the concept of a native name and a foreign name for whatever region that you're in. And what pattern to use when you're creating initials or monograms or initials, and what order. So I have a few examples for English, Japanese, and Chinese. So for instance, for English, the default formality is informal. In Japanese, the default formality is formal. All of them have got a default length of medium. And then there's, under the auxiliary items, it says native space replacement. And so what that does is, if I have native characters and I see spaces in the pattern, what do I replace those with? And in this case, so let's say in Japanese, I will remove the spaces and then join the characters together. So then I'll remove this. And the reason why it's done this way, it's basically a programmatic construct, so that if you get characters that are outside of the default script for that locale, you keep the spaces that are in the pattern. So it's just kind of a fix to be able to help from languages from other cultures or other scripts in the formatting locale that you're in. And so we have the concept of, there's the formatting locale that I'm actually asking for the name to be formatted in. And then there's the name locale, which it may have a locale attribute that's passed in. And I'll show that with some data examples. The data, when it's passed in, to the formatters can specify some additional attributes. So you have, for instance, a name given, or you can add an additional modifier such as informal. So that way you can indicate what is the formal name as well as the informal name within a single data object that gets passed into the formatter. And then the formatter is able to use the instructions based on the context. If it's looking for informal and can't find it, wasn't passed in, it'll just pass to the name or the name field without the modifier on it. So if it's doing a particular format, expecting a particular style, and can't find it, it knows to do the fallback to whatever the base field is. So this is an example of if I have Jonathan Smith and has a nickname of John or informal name, using all three of those attributes, medium length, addressing as the usage, and informal for the formality, it would just be John, because it would pull out, in this case for English, it only is looking at the given informal, if that's available, otherwise use just given. And so it just comes out John. That second name is Alexandra Alexandrovich Sarasri. Serebrov. So the nickname for Alexandra is Sasha. So for medium addressing informal in Russian, it's also just looking for the given informal if it's available, otherwise given. So it would come out as Sasha. If we look instead at a more formal name with the medium referring, talking about the person, it would be Jonathan Smith, or for the other individual, it would be Alexander Alexandrovich Sapropov. I almost got that. I'm not a Russian speaker. Another modifier that can be added to data is the concept of prefix and core. And this was created specifically to handle Dutch and then other languages that have similar capabilities, but specifically for Dutch, because you have things like Vandenberg or Van Gogh or other names like that. And that initial prefix, if you're in the Netherlands, is treated separately from the core part of the name. So when you're sorting it, you break those two apart, and then for instance, if you're doing sorting, let's say we have Daniela Helena Vandenberg, could be represented with a surname prefix of Van Den and the surname core as Berg. When in any of the other formats that request just surname, it looks for surname and can't find it. But if it sees core and prefix, or prefix and core, it knows to combine those two based on the rules for that particular locale. So using the order sorting and then medium format, then it becomes Berg, comma, Daniela H. Van Den. So it's able to break that apart. So when you have a sorted list, it actually sorts correctly for someone in the Netherlands. If, however, you speak Dutch and you're in Belgium, that rule changes and it ignores the prefix and core. And if they exist, we'll just combine them together. And it would be Vandenberg, comma, Daniela H. So the rules based on the locale for the region that you're in. So the survey tool, so there's, I was just thinking that there's two sites I go to all the time. One of them is Richard Ishida's UniView and the apps that he has to play with all my Unicode data and convert them back and forth and so on. And the other one is CLDR survey tool. And this gives you the ability to actually dive in and look at what is happening where based on the different regions. So on the survey tool, so I've gone into English and chosen the person name formats, and we can see initially the defaults. So given first, anything undefined or English. In this case, I'm in English, and then if I see any name data that comes across that happens to have a locale setting for Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Cantonese, and Chinese, then I want to have surname first as a default. So that way, so an example here is during the Summer Olympics that were in Japan, the government of Japan wanted to be sure that all Japanese athletes had their name represented with their surname first, and then their given name afterwards. And so with the formatting rules here, if you have a Japanese name that comes in and says, my locale is actually Japanese, then we would format with Japanese with the surname first, and then the given name would be afterwards. Then we see other default parameters. The formality is informal, length is medium. We don't worry about foreign space replacement. We just let the spaces and the patterns act on their own. If we see initials, we take under the covers, we're taking the first grapheme of the first word, and then we will, in this case, add a full stop period afterwards. And if we have a pattern of initials, like we want to have multiple initials, in this case, we've got no space between the initials. So we just combine them all together. And then we have, just we say how it works, a set of sample data. For instance, a mononym, Zendaya, who, by the way, happens to be from Oakland, just up the street here. Then some other examples for, now you see here, it says native. So native given only, native given with surname, native with two given names and a surname, a native full name, and this is just be sure we use all of the fields so we can test it out. MP Junior, so this is Mr. Bertram Wilberforce with a given informal name of Bertie. If we wanted two surnames, we don't use that in English, but for a given two name, there's Herbert Robert. So this is something I have to tell product managers working with engineers who think they're doing some fun tricks where they go, well, we'll just make it easy and give them a full name to enter when they're onboarding to the product, and go, oh, gee, but we need to have a first name and last name for the credit card. So we'll just do a split on spaces. And the first one is the first name and the last one is the last name. But that doesn't work because people can have any number of delineated words within their name. Then we have, and this is important, the concept of foreign names. And the reason why we do that is to be able to test how well do we format names that have come from other locales. So that's a different name locale from the formatting locale that I'm in. So in this case, we added some additional ones for the same concepts of a given surname, given surname, and a full name. And then we have a set of patterns. I won't go through all of them. It'll give you an idea as the patterns are defined by the linguists who are contributing from the different member organizations in Unicode, and they've been filled out for all of our modern languages. And we go through a super extensive process of testing to be sure they've got the formats right, does it make sense for what they're asking for, do a lot of research in the native language of wiki pages, and then map it back and see how it works. So for example, we have a long referring, let me bring this down so you can see the whole thing, long referring formal, and the example comes up, and it shows the first batch of how it looks in the native, and then how it looks with foreign. So you don't see a lot of difference here. And then we add in some that are stored in the test data for foreign name and script. So let's say if it comes in Russian characters or in Japanese, how is it going to format in my current locale? And so that's, so there's long referring formal, long addressing formal, long referring informal, long addressing informal. It goes through all the permutations to be sure that all the different syntaxes are hit. And then it does that for given name first, surname first. And then how does it look for sorting? If I'm actually going to be sorting the data. So if we look down here for The English, you can see it's doing based on the surname, comma, and then the given names afterwards. This is the short form, which happens to just be adding the initials that are in place, which might be useful for citation references in the science paper, for instance. So I didn't want to go through every single one because I think you'll all start falling asleep after a wonderful lunch. But then let's take a look at how this changes. Let's say we'll go into Japanese, and now I'm in Japanese, and it says, okay, sure, if you're in English or undefined, we'll say given first. But now it has the list of I am Japanese, so surname comes first. And now we see formality, is over on this side, is formal. So I have to change columns here to this winning for the specific locale. So formal with the medium length. And if there's spaces in the pattern, replace it with nothing at all or remove the space. And then we have if we're doing initials, and then you notice for the initial sequence, it shows the variable and then a space and then the variable. So it's like a name 1 space name 2. But because we have the native space replacement says empty, that space should disappear when we're in the native script. So then we have sample native names here in the second column with the Japanese names. And we have to kind of really bend the cultural rules to get a full name to fill in as many as we can. It's just to test out the data. And then adding in, what does it look like in the native script for foreign names? And then we'll see why this is important here. So we have the native script, a number of foreign names. So now if we go down, so we're looking at, we'll look at how it would be in Japan, which would be surname first. And if we go down, let's say here's long addressing informal, and you'll see for the native name, all the spaces have disappeared. But then if you look at the foreign name and script, you'll see that middle dot has been dropped in between the different words. So that's because it says if the formatting patterns, if I find a name that has been passed to me and it's not in the native script, then I need to replace the space patterns with a middle dot. And so we do that with Japanese, we do it with Chinese, and then that can be done with other languages as well. We've tested it out with Thai and a number of others. And then we have foreign name and script, and since it's the short one there, we'll go to, oops, errors. Okay, and here you can see if it's a foreign script, now it doesn't have middle dots between like the Russian characters or the Latin characters. So what happened here is the formatting engine looked at the characters that were passed in the data, and it said, these characters do not match the default for this locale. Let me step out, find the best locale match for these characters, and based on the best locale match, I'll use that formatting pattern. And in this case, since it's surname first, it happens to have the surname first as Wooster, Mr. Bertram Wilberforce. So has the still has a surname first in this case. But if you're in the formatting engine, then based on the locale was passed in with the data, based on the information here, since it's not one of the surname first locales, then we would go and choose the given first, and it would look correct. So that way, if you, for instance, are publishing a newspaper and you have news about someone and it's in Latin characters, it would look correct in the Latin characters. And then if you switch to the katakana representation of that name, then the formatter would then represent it and would, in this case, would flip so that the surname would then appear first, yet the surname would be last in the Latin representation if the data is passed in correctly. So Survey Tool is your friend to figure out which one of these do I want to use for the context I'm in, for the specific representation that I have. And so cases that you have, let's say you have automated mailings that are going out to customers and you want to go, you know, dear customer. Well, today you've probably seen, several of you probably say, dear first name. And in this case, you would say, like, dear addressing informal, if you want to use that, or you use addressing. And then what would happen is then the formatter will choose the formality for you, which is important because if you're going to Japan, you want to use the formal as opposed to a lot of the West to be the informal. And it makes it a lot easier than having to build up a bunch of your own data structures to figure, I want to use Mr., I want to use Herr Schmidt here, but I want to use John over here or whatever. Just use letting the formatter fall into whatever the defaults are. And go back into here. So now we'll look at some real world examples. So how much time do I have? So I can, because we started a little on the late side. I don't know how fast to accelerate here. Okay, I can do this 10 minutes. So, so now we'll talk about some real world cases that you have. So the first one is pretty straightforward. It's a passport. We don't have a pattern for how to fill in a passport. But if you have the data, it's pretty straightforward on how to put that in. Passport only has two fields according to international standards, a primary identifier and a secondary identifier. So that primary identifier usually comes back to the surname. The secondary identifier usually relates back to what they call the forenames or the given names. So I won't spend much time on that, but just know that it exists. The example I had was from Peru, and so there were two surnames in that individual. Now, one question that we keep getting again and again is that, but I have my name represented this way, but I have my data as this way. So the way that you implement that, if you're actually building an application, is you need multiple data objects to be able to handle it based on if the syntax changes much differently from what you have. So example is Bruce Lee. So his legal name is Jufan Lee, but he may want to have a preferred name. So what I've done is just built up a simple JSON object and added a couple of things at the end. One's a person ID and the other one is at the top. And the other one is, I'm just calling it a name type, just something I made up. It's not in the person name guidelines, but I just put it in to illustrate the point. So you'll see that the person ID is the same for both of these. So that means in your database, it's going to be the same person, but it has two different person types that have been put in place. So I have my legal name because I have compliance to talk to, but for everything else, Bruce Lee wants to be known as Bruce Lee. Another example is Pablo Picasso. So we talked about how many names you can have. Pablo Picasso's birth name is Pablo Diego Jose Francisco de Paulo Juan Nepomuceno Banea de los Remedios Cipriano de la Santísima Trinidad Ruiz y Picasso. And he prefers to be known as just Pablo Picasso. So, and there's, so this could actually be even more of a permutation because he just went by Pablo Picasso, but he had two surnames that he was known by, Ruiz Picasso. So in the most common case will, for the informal, less formal case, will use the first surname. So you'd have to have an additional change to make that work a little bit. Another example, this was one of Picasso's friends, and he drew a detailed picture of her. And Henrietta Theodora Markovich, she was French, and she didn't like that at all, so she basically went by the name of Dora Maar and used that term. So another case of using a different preferred name. A formal name or informal names. So you may have heard of Forrest Alexander Gump, and he, in the book, had a friend when he was in Vietnam named Bubba, and Bubba passed away fighting in Vietnam and gave him an idea of starting a shrimp business. And so one thing led to another, and Forrest Gump made a tremendous amount of money selling shrimp because a hurricane knocked out all the boats in the region except his. And so he named his company Bubba Gump Shrimp. So people just started calling him Bubba Gump. So you could potentially put in a given informal name, and so the medium referring informal in English becomes Bubba Gump. We have to deal with mononyms, and it's just one field put into the data. So we've designed the data that you have to have at least one of the name fields filled in, ideally given or surname. Passport office would want you to have the surname at a minimum. So Zendaya's birth name or legal name is Zendaya Marie Stormer Coleman, and she's changed her name basically everywhere is only Zendaya. But then that's also the case in Indonesia. So in Indonesia, there is no concept of a given name and a surname. When you're born, there's one field that you fill in. It's a full name. So like Sukarno, that's his name, his whole name. If you're filling in a passport application, there's only one field that fills in. So normally that shouldn't be an issue if you're having onboarding or data system that's running in Indonesia, and the format specifiers and patterns in CLDR will correctly do the formatting if you have all the fields filled in, but you have to have at least one filled in. The issue will be something that we don't handle, which is how to parse that name apart. If you just have a full name, that will be between you and whoever the real person is. But you can pretty easily use the format patterns to be able to create that full name to put into any fields that need to be handled in Indonesia. Another question that we've had a lot of is, but wait, I go by my second name. So that's a case where you want to then use a different data object. So if you take Mrs. Augusta, Ada Byron, King, Countess of Lovelace, you would have a different data object for a preferred name of Ada Lovelace, which is the name that she used for the mathematics papers that she published. And so that would be the term that you would use. So we need two data objects to handle that. We don't have a mechanism to choose only a second name versus a first name. You could have like a given informal, and we haven't worked out like a given to informal that's blank or something. So right now it'd be a separate data object. Then the question we also get is, but I need more than one script for my name because I have my name in my native script and I want to have an international version and so on. So go back to Bruce Lee and you would have his, whoops, I went back. So, well, I went forward to Hayao Miyazaki. So Hayao Miyazaki in Japanese, you may have his name in Latin characters, and your data would have his kanji name, and then you would have his kana name. And you may be able to represent that, for instance, either with the locale tag or use your own type IDs. There's a few things like, I think JA-Latin breaks the formatter at this point because it doesn't know how to resolve it correctly. So there's a few things that we have to do some testing on. But since JA-Latin isn't like a best fit, got 5 minutes, okay. So the idea is that in your data, you have some like ID that takes all the names and maps it to one individual in a person object. And then you have different name objects depending on the context and where you need to use it. Another fun part is declensions. So anyone here come from a region where your name has declensions? So a few of you, okay. So with the declensions, the name itself changes based on the grammatical case. And we already know that we have a vocative case and a nominative case based on the definition of the patterns. And we had requests to say, but this genitive case keeps coming up, the possessive case that something comes across. And I'm going, oh, who would be a good example? So my family's hosted international students for the last quarter century or so, and one of our students was this guy, Rolandus Gimbutas. He is 2 meters, 10 centimeters tall and was an Olympic swimmer from Lithuania. So I said, Lithuania, of course, they have declensions. So I figured out what would Rolandus look like if we put in the declension cases. So one of the latest things that we've done is we added the concept of allowing for languages that have it, a vocative case, and for languages that have it, the concept of a genitive case. So that ends up requiring you to add additional data renditions or values to be able to have that. So when the format goes into the formatter, it knows to use that if it's available. So for Rolandus, you would have a given of Rolandus with a given vocative of Rolandi and a given genitive of Rolando. And then the surname, similarly, would be Gimbutas, Gimbuti, and Gimbutio. And then to see how that would look, for instance, in language, I used it, Mr. versus the Pola for Lithuanian. So like talking about him would be Rolandus Gimbutas. And if you're talking to him, you know, hello, Rolandus, would be Svelkas Rolandai. And if you're saying that this is Rolandus's medal that he won at the Olympics, Rolando Gimbutio Olympinis Medalis. So that allows you to have a much more correct grammatical rendition of the names. It's only those 2 additional cases that we've added. So the future, we're looking at different cases that have come in. One thing that we'll be looking at is validations. In CLDR, there's the concept of exemplar characters. What characters are used to represent this language with some auxiliary characters? We don't expect to go past beyond any real simplistic language rules. We might consider there are different regional rules in some areas. So in the UK, for instance, there is a list of allowed accented characters in names. In Japan, I don't think we can get away with their list of specific Japanese characters and so on. Things that we can also do is inherit from the security standards in Unicode to check for mixed scripts, for instance, for validation. Things that we will not do is bad word checking, because in almost any case, there's a bad word that you find in English, you'll find somebody has that as their real name in another country. Other thing is length checking. We could potentially have some kind of length checking, but you saw like with Pablo Picasso with this his given to name can get pretty long. So that would most likely be implementation defined. Likewise with number of words. Another area that we're solving is issue with glottal stops that are used in languages. So in Polynesian languages, they use, in Hawaiian, it's called the okina. Or sometimes they just use an apostrophe in front. So like a name, Aika Kanaka Koi Hoka Lololo. These are the monogram of her name. Today, what would happen is it sees that first character as a glottal stop is recognized as a letter, and that's the only thing it'll take. And you'll just have the glottal stop K. And so we're looking at how to resolve that for languages that have glottal stops to recognize it as if it were first grapheme. We only covered 2 grammatical cases, so we'll be investigating how or why to be able to add additional modifiers to handle additional grammatical cases. In a lot of cases, you have to know the gender of the individual in a language to be able to determine what declension to use, because masculine and feminine names may have the same word ending, but have different declensions. And that leads into the next one, which is we've also had requests for how to handle pronouns. We do not expect to create the actual pronoun data beyond the basics, because as the gender diversity continues to expand worldwide, people choose a wide range of what they want to be chosen from. So there's this concept of neopronouns that I pulled this from a report from IBM that potentially people could choose different things. So we're thinking of the idea of different pronoun categories. So is it a personal pronoun, possessive adjective, possessive pronoun, or reflexive pronoun? So that we can choose from the standard list or add your own for how you want to be called. And that's it.
We don't have time for questions.